Come on, Aggie. I don't want to call anybody up, but come on, Aggie. All right, you know I'm not Jeff, so no surprise there. But I'm honored to be your teacher today. It's a blessing to come before you. Such a talented and good bunch of people to work with. I enjoy teaching, but this is not exactly my comfort zone here with the cameras rolling and that kind of stuff. So if I seem a little nervous, I'll relax here after a while. Wanted to get started with a couple of things. Jeff had covered first couple of chapters of Samuel, 1 Samuel, 2 weeks ago, so it's been a while. You probably slept since then. So I wanted to just kind of review a couple of things that he had talked about. And that's what's nice about the technology, because I could go back through after he asked me to teach. I thought, oh, where did he stop, So I just pulled up the video, and played it back and said, okay, there it is. So again, we have all these great things to work with, all these tools, and sometimes we just waste them. Man, you people that weren't here for the first service are in store for a good lesson from the pulpit later on today. So I'm really glad that the word that was spoken by Corey this morning is the same word that we're going to look at today. Jeff had started out, and he had looked at a balance between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that balance, I think what he was really trying to say is that we need to kind of do a flashback. You know how they do this in the movies in Hollywood? And they start out and they show some scene, and things blow up, and then they go like 2 weeks earlier or 2 hours earlier or something, right? And they flash back and they say, now this is what happened. So that's kind of where the New Testament Christians were at their time. They were in that flashback mode because they didn't have the book that we have today. They didn't have the technology and stuff that we have today. They had to go back, right? They had to go back. They were back, all right? So here's the key. So we're kind of in that situation where we need to be able to understand that flashback and see that picture. I think it's just a good idea to keep that perspective in mind. And it lets us see, I think looking at the Old Testament again, lets us see what Jesus saw. Because remember, all these things that happened, all these things that took place, he was there in some form or another. And just like Corey talked about today, Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And it works the other way around. In the Old Testament, if you've seen the Father, you've seen me. But they haven't seen him yet, all right? So the books and original writings, which he talked about, and his math was right. I went back and checked it after I listened to the video. I said, was there really 55 chapters in Samuel 1 and 2? Because originally, you see, the book of Samuel was written as one book, or the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, written as one book. And kind of interesting story, but I'm kind of trying to keep this short because Lee wants to use a little time to do some singing here this morning. But anyhow, just as an aside, when the scrolls were written for Samuel, they were extra long. And so it's kind of like in today's technology, when you try to download something for your email and it won't fit, right? You have to break it up into 2 parts. Well, guess what? That all started back in the Old Testament times because in the books of Samuel were too long to put on one scroll, so they were broken up in 2, and so we ended up with 1st and 2nd Samuel. But the whole scheme, the whole idea here is there's 3 phases that God kind of looks at in these chapters, if you want to call it 55 chapters of the books of Samuel. So you got Samuel, you got Saul, and you have David. 3 phases that the Old Testament takes us through. And so the author, he talked about the author a little bit. Don't think it's too important here because there are so many different variations that you see out there in the real world about who wrote it. And it may have been Samuel. Samuel may not have written any of it, but it was all recorded. If you look at the book of Chronicles, especially 1st Chronicles, not so much in the 2nd, but you'll see a real parallel, in this case almost a reiteration of those things talked about in Samuel. So we can review, or look at this whole thing in cycles. A lot of the history, a lot of the things here that I had to go back because we just don't spend so much time in the Old Testament. But this idea of tribes and the tribal way of life and the environment, and Corey in his lesson talked a little bit about politics. And so you have politics today and those kind of things. And the purpose of the book, after the fact, New Testament, in those times when the Babylonian captivity had taken place, right? All those things, the people of Israel were under the regime of Babylon, and they didn't understand this. They were like, what happened? God, what's going on? And so Samuel records these things, so we'll kind of have an idea of where these place. So in the beginning here, with the book of Samuel, we kind of start a new phase, if you want to look at it that way. So we're ending up Judges. We've looked through Ruth, and so we've talked about how God spoke to the people through Judges and how they ruled and how they took care of things. And so we're going to see in Samuel here how this transition starts to take place to where we're going to go from where God speaks to the people in various forms, in this case through judges, through prophets, through priests, and then he's going to move to a kingship. And if this doesn't sound familiar, think about New Testament things and what Jesus went through and reaching his kingship, right? All through his ministry, he tries to convince people. He says, yeah, it's a kingship, but it's not the kind of kingship that you're looking for. And that's one of the things in their purpose that they were purposed for, that they were looking for that kingship. So the book of Judges closes at that time. Jeff looked through the first couple of chapters. So there's Samuel's birth in his early life. There's some discussion whether he was a Levi or not. And I got to looking at this and I thought, well, how can he not be a Levite, right? He's in the priesthood, right? He's studying under Eli the priest, so he couldn't even get in the door if he wasn't a priest. Okay, so that's kind of like what Corey's going to talk about when you hear his lesson, wasted words. It's kind of a redundancy. So let me fire up my tablet here, and we'll want to look at a couple of things and see. Get it turned around, right? So I want to start with, I think I'll just read the 3rd chapter and then we'll talk about that. Try to get through, Jeff said he wanted to get through chapter 6. It's going to be hard to do, but I can do this. Okay, so turn in your Bibles, right? If you got your Bibles, your screens or whatever, go to the 3rd chapter of 1 Samuel. Are you there? Okay. Now, close your books, turn your screens off, and listen to me, because I'm going to read to you the words of life. When God speaks to us, sometimes we need to listen, right? Don't sit there and read along with me. I don't want you to do that, all right? Sometimes when I was teaching in my classes, I would just tell students, I say, put your books down, right? Put things away. Turn your screens off. Listen to me, because what I'm going to say is of most importance, and if you don't get these building blocks, you're just not going to take the next step, right? So that's kind of what I want you to see here. I'm going to read to you this 3rd chapter of Samuel, and I want you to listen. Words of God speak. Would you pour down like rain? Let me see your majesty. All right? Words of God speak. Would you pour down like rain? It's from a song. I don't know. You probably don't know it. Probably haven't heard it maybe. But anyhow, it's one of my favorites. So listen. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. And in those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. And one night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. And the lamp of God had not gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. And then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "No, I did not call you. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. And again the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me, my son." And Eli said, "No, I didn't call you. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and so the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. So a third time the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go lie down, if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling out as other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the eyes of everyone who hears about it tingle. And at that time I'll carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. And therefore I swore to the house of Israel, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." So Samuel lay down until morning, and then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. And he was afraid to tell Eli the vision. But Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, said, "Here I am." And he said, "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked, "And do not hide it from me. May God be with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. And Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." And so the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's word fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord, and the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh. So, third chapter, there it is. How many times have you heard this story? You know, I remember hearing this as a kid when I grew up. You know, and you always think, well, what's so strange? What's different here? Well, first of all, why didn't Eli hear what Samuel was hearing? What happened? Right? What's different here? Because before this time, Eli and God were like this together, right? When God spoke, Eli listened. But now he wasn't hearing. What happened? So what you need to understand at this point is there's kind of a transition going on here between, it's kind of like, I guess we would call it a passing of the baton today, right? So it's kind of like, okay, God's not talking to you anymore, Eli, so they're changing. And things are changing rapidly. So he doesn't understand kind of what's going on. So really not wasted words that we go back and forth 3 times before God really, or before Eli really realizes what's going on. And but it's not a surprise, because if you look at the end of chapter 2, God gave him the warning. He said, here's what's going to happen because of your inability to take care of the things that I have given to you. So we looked at that warning. I want a couple of things I need to look at here in chapter 3 real quick. Like, we can see that those things that are taking place are hard for, maybe hard for Eli to see. Things that I was reading through and reviewing this that I thought was really interesting is that, at this time, Samuel was, of course, under the priesthood, under Eli, and Eli was already pretty old, couldn't hear very well, And that was the reason, one of the reasons that that Samuel was in the same chambers that Eli was in, because he was kind of ministering to him as well as to the Lord. So many things that are, I think, interesting here that we kind of gloss over when we look at these particular sections. You know, the way Samuel, I'm thinking the way he grew up, wow, you know, he lived in the temple, right? All these robes, all these neat things, and guess what? His mom made him an ephod the same way, I don't know if it was the same what Eli had, but it was similar, right? And he wore those priestly robes when he was in there, and I'm thinking, wow, that must have been like different, you know? So all the other kids are outside playing football and shooting hoops, doing all that kind of stuff, and here's Samuel in the house of the Lord ministering, and I'm going like, wow, that's exciting. But you see, I mean, this all plays into the sovereignty, and I'll talk about that just briefly, the sovereignty of God. Sometimes when I'm looking for definitions and I'm listening to different sermons and I put things together, Parker Willis, a couple of years ago, one of his first lessons was from Daniel, the 7th chapter. And he talks about the visions, of course, of God and what was revealed to him. And but the whole theme, the way Parker put it together, just stuck in my head. And so it goes like this. He is able, he may not, but you can trust him no matter what. Right? 3 simple phases, and it just like, boom, stuck right in my head. And so every time I think about somebody says, well, what's the sovereignty of God? And I just look at him and say, well, he is able, he may not, but you can trust him no matter what. All right? And so that theme rolls all through this particular book, and as we see in chapter 3, things are changing, and so the boy Samuel, from 3 or 4, we don't know, it may be even 5 years, but when he was weaned, he was turned over to the priesthood. I often wonder, you know, because I think of my relationship to my parents and stuff, and I'm thinking, wow, he missed all that, right? Think about it. He missed all that. Where's mom, right? You got all these priests, right? And you got these sacrifices, and you got animals being cut up and blood thrown up against the wall. And guess what? At the end of the day, oh yeah, Samuel, it's cleanup time, right? The sacrifices are over. It's cleanup time. And I'm thinking, wow, man of God, Samuel. Let's look at chapter 4 real quick like. Yeah, I got time. This goes, what is there, like 22 verses, so that'll read pretty fast. So follow along. You can follow along with me. You don't have to close them up. But anyhow, I think once in a while, you should just listen to the word. There's all kinds of venues out there on different online Bibles and that kind of stuff. Some of them may want a fee or whatever for the audible part, but you can always find free ones. Bible Gateway has a real good source. They got many different versions if you don't like NIV or American Standard, whatever. So there's a lot of ways to listen to God's word, not just read it, listen to it. It's just so much different, just like being there. So in 1 Samuel chapter 4, Samuel's word came to all Israel, right? Where's Eli? He's gone, okay? So he says, now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. Is it Philistines or Philistines? Whatever, tomato. Okay, and he says, the Israelites camped at Ebenezer, and we're kind of familiar with that from the song, and the Philistines at Aphek. And the Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. Then when soldiers returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant and Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. And hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What is all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" And when they learned it was the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said, and "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods?" And they are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues and in the wilderness. And so be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated again. And he says, every man fled to his tent, and the slaughter was very great, and Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. And that same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And when he arrived there was Eli sitting in his chair by the side of the road, watching because his heart feared for the ark of God. And when the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. And Eli heard the outcry and says, "What is the meaning of the uproar?" And the man hurried over, and Eli, who was 98 years old, and whose eyes had failed so that he could not see, he told Eli, "I have just come from the battle line, and I fled from it this very day." And Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" And the man who brought the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of the God has been captured." And when he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backwards off his chair by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man. And he was heavy, and he led Israel 40 years. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, and near the time of delivery, when she heard the news that the ark had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth and was overcome by her labor pains. And as she was dying, the women attending her said, "Don't despair, you have given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay attention. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel because of the capture of the ark of God, the death of her father-in-law and her husband." And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." So there, the end of chapter 4. I told Jeff, I said I really wanted to talk about battle because I love battle stuff. You know, he loves mysteries and that kind of stuff and putting things together and like working with puzzles and doing those kind of things. Not me. I love battle. I love strategy. I love the fight. I love the smell, right, of the fear of battle, getting together. So back in those days, battle was everything. It was hand to hand. The Israelite nation at that time were just kind of in a lull, I guess you would say. And so they weren't necessarily in a fighting mood. But as you may know, in the Old Testament times, there was a season for battle. Right? In the wintertime, things were cold and wet and muddy, and it wasn't nice to get out and fight with the boys. You know, get out there and do hand-to-hand. It's like, no, it's too cold. It's rainy today. Don't want to get out. But right? When it came war season, it was time to go like, you know what, so-and-so, my neighbor over here took over this creek, you know, so now I can't put my sheep out there anymore, and I want that land back, right? So he goes to the big chief of the tribe, and the chief of the tribe says, okay, here's number one on the list for the war coming up, right? Here it is, right? It's coming down the line. We're going to go to war, and we're going to do this. We're going to get this guy's land back. We're going to take care of this. This city was overrun a couple of weeks ago. We're going to take it back. So it was time for war. Well, these people, they didn't have, you know, they weren't like National Guard. They weren't just called up. They just showed up, you know, and said, wait a minute, what are you going to do with a hoe? What are you going to do with that shovel? We'll just make it into some kind of weapon. We'll go out there and fight, okay? So that, when they talk about battle, man, it was crude. It was crude stuff. It wasn't prepared. You know, they got together and think about it. Think about all the history you see of Old Testament fights and stuff. Well, they camped out. Well, what kind of surprise is that? Where's the drones? Where's your spies? You just camp out and sit on the hill and go like, all right, what time? when are we going to do this? Okay? And so that's kind of the way it was. It was really strange. But anyhow, just to kind of put it in a nutshell sort of thing. So they go to fight and they lose, and they're not expecting that. Why? Because God's always been with him, right? He's always been with him. So the question, I think, as I got this section done, is this the God of the ark, or is this the ark of God? Right? Who's in charge here, So is God really in this ark? Well, I don't think so. If he was in there, he wouldn't let it get captured, right? And so it's God's ark, and he lets whatever happen to it, right? And so it's taken by the Philistines, and they, of course, they drag it in, and we look in, and I'm kind of forging ahead so I can get some of this done. So he moves ahead and says basically, the ark's been captured. Bad news. I mean, for all of Israel at that time, this golden box, if you want to call it that, was of paramount importance to them. But at that time, it just seems like when this was, I guess this was at Shiloh, and the people just, like I say, were in kind of a lull. They really didn't, they weren't paying attention, I guess you want to call it that. They weren't doing justice, let's put it that way, to the service, to the worship of God. And of course, he was disappointed. And so he let the ark go, just to show them, I think, nothing else, right? To show them that he's more than this. He's more than this box, and he is worthy of your worship. So let me just briefly go through, I'm looking at the contents here of chapter 5. The ark gets captured. I'm not going to read all that for want of time. But the Philistines take it to their temple, and their quote god of the day, if you want to call it that, was Dagon, and his statue was huge. So that's one of the things, I had to put that in my mind when they took the ark in and put it with Dagon. I thought, well, what's the deal here? What's the importance? Well, the Philistines had this giant statue thing, and the Hebrews' little gold box was sitting over here, and it's like, okay, is this God going to pay homage to this God or not? What's going to happen? So as the story goes, and you're probably familiar with that the next day the priests, the Philistines, go into their temple, and they find that their Dagon god has fallen over. Face down, by the way, which is a desecration. So they pick him back up, come back in the next day, and what happens? He's fallen again, but this time both his arms and his legs are gone. So he's like helpless. And of course, the Philistines are looking at this, and their priests are going like, whoa, this is not a good sign, right? This is not the way things were supposed to go. So if you look at kind of the end of chapter 5, go to about, because it's really short. Look at chapter 5, verse 8. So he said, they called together the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? And they answered, have the gods of the ark moved to Gath? And so they moved the ark of the God of Israel. And they move it, and there was great panic and that kind of stuff. And they were kind of, I guess, hit with a plague, if you want to call it that. And so they sent the god to Ekron, and so they move it around, and they keep having problems with it and realize that, hey, there's more power here. There's more things going on than what we expected, right? So, I'm going to get there. Chapter 6. So it says, when the ark of the Lord had been in the Philistine territory 7 months, you know, I don't know, I meant to call this out to you, but notice a lot of the things, 40, 77, all those numerical things that are important back in those biblical times and even in the New Testament times. The numbers don't dwell on them that much. They're not all that important. But 7 months is quite a while, right? And so the Hebrew nation, the Israelites, were without their God as they saw it for 7 months. And so the Philistines called together, of course, their priests and bring them in. And they say, well, you know, how are we going to get rid of this thing? And their priests basically tell them, no, hey, you know, we've got to do some kind of a worship and a payback to them, if you want to call it that. And I guess they called it a kind of a guilt gift, I guess, or whatever. And they said we need to give them a guilt offering. So they give them gold made up of these tumors like they had, killing them off. And also the rats, and I guess some authors seem to think that the reason there was rats there was supposedly this thing that they had that God had inflicted them with was like a plague, right, carried by mice, rats, whatever. So the Philistines put this together. This was such a wild story when I reviewed it again. I completely forgot about how they had plotted, if you want to call it that, to send the ark back. But anyhow, they took what was it? They took two cows that had calved. I guess I'd have to ask Jerry about all this stuff with cattle and whatever. But anyhow, they took two cows that had calved. And they took the calves away, and apparently that's not a good thing, right? Mama doesn't like babies being taken away. But anyhow, they took these two cows, put them on I guess on a wagon kind of thing, and hitched them up to this cart, and it was supposed to go back to the Israelite nation. And so the priest told them basically, here's kind of in a nutshell how the story goes. So the priest basically tell them, say, okay, hitch them up, put the calves away, turn the cows loose with the cart and see which way they go, right? And if they come back to us, well, the whole thing was a hoax and it wasn't real at all. But if they go on to the Israelite nation, well, we're okay. We did the right thing and we may be appeased from their gods, right? And so that's kind of the gist of how it goes. And I thought, wow, what a superstitious, if you want to call it that, trail to follow, right? So today we would call that covering your bases, right? So we're going to cover our bases. So if these cows, if they take the ark to the Israelite nation, we made it, we're safe. But if they come back here, the gods and stuff of the Israelites were nothing, right? We can continue on. We'll be all right. Okay. So that's kind of the way the narration, if you want to call it that, kind of finishes up in this particular part. At the end, well, I guess in verse 21, chapter 6, and then it says, they sent messengers to the people of Kiriath Jearim, saying, the Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to your town. And you can this saga, this story, this narration just continues on, and to me it just gets better and better, right? It just gets more enriching because you get in further into God's relationship with his people back then, how it parallels to our relationship today. So many things that are important. Let me just close with God. God gives you something every day. Something every day he gives to you. What are you going to do with it? Right? He gave Hannah a son. She gave it up to the Lord for worship, for him to be the next, quote, leader of the Israel nation. God's given you something. What are you going to do with it? I'm done. You got it, Lee.
So this morning at the end of our worship service, we're going to be learning a song, I Will Wait for You.